Hello, and welcome to this video on cognitive theories. During this segment, I will be sharing with you about a few different cognitive theories and how we can use what those theories teach us to design more relevant content for our students and be better instructional designers. My name is Allison, and I will be your presenter today. The first cognitive theory that we're going to discuss is cognitive load theory. One really important thing to keep in mind with regard to cognitive load theory is the working memory. The working memory is extremely limited, and it can really only hold about 2 to 4 pieces of new information at a time. Furthermore, there are 3 types of cognitive load, and those are intrinsic cognitive load, extraneous cognitive load, and germane cognitive load. So now we'll go ahead and break those down. Intrinsic cognitive load is caused by the inherent complexity of the material. So these are the different interacting elements, and you really can't change the intrinsic cognitive load without changing the nature of the task or also taking into consideration prior knowledge. So intrinsic cognitive load is what you're really aiming for the learner to take away from a learning activity or a lesson. And the prior knowledge is important because if a learner has prior knowledge on a subject, their intrinsic cognitive load is actually reduced because it's not new information that the working memory has to deal with. Now, extraneous cognitive load is really all of the extra stuff. It's the stuff that doesn't really enhance the learner's experience or their ability to learn the information. And extraneous cognitive load can be caused by poor instructional design, poor instruction in general. It's really just adding unnecessary information or extra frills or details that really don't enhance the learner's experience. It also usually distracts learners from being able to absorb the essential information. And extraneous cognitive load actually places more demand on the working memory and really takes away some of the capacity that could be used to process the essential elements or deal with the intrinsic load. Germane cognitive load could also be known as effective cognitive load. What this is referring to is the resources in the working memory that are devoted to dealing with the intrinsic or essential information rather than extraneous information. Germane cognitive load is not only desirable, but it is beneficial to the learner. As instructional designers, one of the most important things to keep in mind with regard to cognitive load theory is the need to reduce extraneous load. We want to make sure that we're getting rid of the extra unnecessary things in our instruction. And you also want to make sure that you're managing the intrinsic cognitive load so that your learners can learn the essential information, but also make sure that it's not too overwhelming with all of the important and essential elements. And then, of course, we want to foster germane cognitive load because it is, again, desirable and beneficial to learners. The next theory that we will be discussing is the cognitive theory of multimedia learning. This theory, much like cognitive load theory, recognizes that the human working memory is extremely limited. However, it expands on it a little bit with 3 assumptions. The first is that in the working memory or in the human mind, there are dual channels. There is a channel for auditory and one for visual. Again, like I said, there is a limited capacity. So the second assumption of the cognitive theory of multimedia learning is that it has limited capacity. However, each channel has a limited capacity and they are indeed separate. The third assumption is active processing. And this means that when we're learning something, there is a process of selecting information, organizing it in the mind, and then integrating it into existing schemas or a working knowledge. The cognitive theory of multimedia learning also uses some similar terms as the cognitive load theory. and that is that intrinsic cognitive load could also be referred to as essential information, and extraneous is also still referred to as extraneous, and then germane cognitive load is referred to as generative. So what we need to do as instructional designers is really aim to manage that essential load, that essential information, reduce the extraneous, so again, get rid of the extra things that are going to either distract or overload your learner, and then really encourage the generative processing. Again, we really need to be careful not to overload either channel with either too much essential information, but especially not overload either channel with extraneous information. Now we're going to discuss 3 principles that you can use to enhance your students' learning. The 3 principles are the coherence principle, the signaling principle, and the spatial contiguity principle. The coherence principle enhances learning by removing extraneous material. If there is extraneous material due to poor instructional design, the auditory or visual channel could be overloaded. If either channel is overloaded, it's possible that your students are not able to focus in on the essential information that you want them to learn. Now I'll show you an example in my own teaching. On this screen in Khan IT, we will be learning how to associate funding to fund a CLIN or contract line item. So you will begin by placing a check mark in the box to the left of the PR number. This will be your first step. And now we're going to go ahead and enter our line obligated amount. And lastly, we'll click Save. Now, what can we see in this example? There is a lot of extra things going on, right? I'm giving my students step-by-step instructions, but the things are labeled with A, B, C. There's a green background. There are interesting font choices. There's really just a lot of extra information going on the screen, and that would also be considered extraneous. So in this example, there is extraneous information that is actually overloading the visual channel probably. And that prevents the students from being able to focus on the task at hand and following what I'm telling them to do. Now let's take a look at this example. All right, students, we're going to learn about how to add funding to a CLIN. We'll begin by placing a check mark in the box to the left of the purchase request. Now you'll go ahead and enter the line item amount, and finally, click Save. The difference that we can see in the second example is a lot of the extraneous and distracting material has been removed. Now we have a plain white background instead of a green one with different fading going on. We don't have any text on the screen, there isn't any font, and that allows the students to really focus on the task at hand and not get distracted by information that could potentially be overloading the visual or auditory channel. The next principle that we will be discussing is the signaling principle. The signaling principle enhances learning by highlighting the essential information. Sometimes you'll hear the signaling principle referred to as the cueing principle. And this is because cues are added to the material to let the students know what's really important or essential. It allows them to remove the extraneous information, at least from their focus, and focus in on what's really important. Cues or signals can be arrows, highlights, bold, anything that really draws the student's eye or attention to the most important information. Today we will be learning about how to attach funding to a CLIN or contract line item. So what you will do is you will begin by placing a check mark to the left of the purchase request number, then entering the line item obligated amount, and finally clicking Save. In the example I just demonstrated, there are some cues on the screen, but there's also a lot of distracting information. And so in a lot of ways, the student's attention isn't being signaled as well as it possibly could. Let's take a look at a different example. All right, students, we're going to be learning how to fund a contract line item. Begin by placing a check mark in the box to the left of the purchase request number. Now, in the box below, you're going to enter the line item obligated amount, and finally, click on the Save button. In the second example, you'll notice how the signals pop up as my voice is talking and explaining what they need to do, and it's drawing their attention to the exact correct spot of the screen. They don't have to scan around, they don't have to look to exactly what words am I talking about. The highlights are right there and they can follow along. The third and final principle that we will be discussing is the spatial contiguity principle. This principle enhances learning by presenting related material relatively close together. The opposite of spatial contiguity is known as separated presentation, in which related information is presented relatively far apart. The reason that spatial contiguity and presenting related information close together is preferable to separated presentation is because it reduces the learner's need to scan back and forth, and thus reduces their cognitive load. When they're not having to do extra tasks that are not related to the essential material that they need to learn, they're able to utilize more working memory on learning the important and essential aspects of the material. All right, we'll be learning on how to associate funding to a contract line item. So you'll see here that there are 3 steps labeled A, B, and C. And if you notice at the bottom, A tells you to place a check mark in the box to the left. So just go ahead and look at step A, and then you can look at step B and step C to see exactly how to do this process. In the example I just presented, the learner is tasked with looking at A, B, and C, and then shifting their focus down to below the screenshot to see what is step A, looking back up, doing it, going down to step B. So what you can see is going on here is that the learner is scanning between the task at hand, which is utilizing this software, and figuring out what the steps are. All right, so we will be associating funding to a contract line item. Your first step here is to place the check marks in the left box of the purchase request. Your second step is going to be to enter a line item obligated amount in the box down there. And the third is to click on the Save button. In the second example, you can see that we're using the auditory and the verbal channel by presenting the directions in a spoken way, and then also just highlighting everything in a 1, 2, 3 manner. So in this case, the student doesn't have to scan back and forth to get the information. They can hear what they're supposed to be doing, and then they can also see everything in a 1, 2, 3 organized way. As you can see in the examples that I just demonstrated, I am responsible for teaching a software system. And what this is it is a new contract writing system for the Air Force's contracting career field. So in addition to presenting instructor-led training, such as I was demonstrating in the examples, we also create computer-based training modules. And one thing that is a bit controversial is the use of quizzing in computer-based training or CBT modules. So I want to address this misconception as well as controversy via refutation text. Many airmen believe that quizzing is a waste of time and unnecessary in training classes. However, this is far from the truth. Quizzing actually helps students commit material to memory more effectively. One of the arguments against quizzing is that people will just look up the information, or they'll skip ahead and figure out what the questions are, go back and find the information. They'll take it again and again until they're able to ace the test, things like this. However, in the case that people actually do try to answer the questions correctly, they are participating in retrieval. And recalling information in a time of need does actually commit material to memory more effectively. In conclusion, we have discussed a few cognitive theories as well as a few principles that you can use to enhance your instruction and instructional design. As a reminder, we discussed the cognitive load theory, the cognitive theory of multimedia learning, the coherence principle, the signaling principle, and the spatial contiguity principle. I've also demonstrated a little bit about each principle and how you could use it effectively and how you could violate it or use it ineffectively. And lastly, we discussed refutation text and how to address misconceptions and lead to conceptual change using a refutation text. I hope this information has been valuable for you and that you're able to incorporate it into your instruction as well as your instructional design to enhance your students' learning. Thank you for joining me today.